So there was a church who was looking for a new pastor, and the call committee was having a hard time agreeing and making a decision. So one of the members of the committee, who was admittedly frustrated and tired of the whole process, she received a letter of introduction from a pastor who was interested in being called. So she read the letter to the committee, and this is what it said. It said, "To the Pastoral Search Committee, it is my understanding that you have a vacancy in your congregation, and I would like to apply for the position. I can't say I preach very well. In fact, I tend to stutter when I speak, and I get stuck on my words. I do have a lot of experience since I'm over 75 years old. I only have recently just had an encounter with God. I heard a voice which told me personally that I was the one to be your pastor. And one never knows when God will appear right before your very eyes. As far as people skills go, I do tend to lose my temper every once in a while. I'm also inclined to want things done my way, and I can get impatient and cranky if not done right away. I once even killed somebody, but since I know you are a gracious person, I know you will believe me when I say that that is all behind me now. I intend on showing up there in a few weeks to lead you to a brighter future. Although I was reluctant at first to work with you, I still feel called to be with you nevertheless." The committee member glanced up at the rest of the group. "So what do you think? Is this the right person to be our congregation's leader or not?" The rest of the committee was horrified. Have an old man with no seminary training who is arrogant, temperamental, hears voices and is an ex-murderer as their pastor? Was this committee member crazy? Who signed the letter of introduction? Who had such a colossal nerve? The committee member eyed each of them keenly before she answered. It's signed Moses. So Moses, he is the least likely candidate by his own standard, and probably by ours, to lead a church. He is filled with flaws, and not just little flaws, big flaws, land you in jail flaws. Yet, God saw fit to call him to lead not only the church, but his people out of Egypt. See, the thing about God is that he is in the habit of choosing extremely flawed people to lead his church. Just listen to this list of misfits. Abraham was old. Elijah was suicidal. Joseph was abused. Job went bankrupt. Moses, he had the speech problem. Gideon was afraid. Rahab was a prostitute. The Samaritan woman was divorced multiple times. Jeremiah was young. Jacob was a cheater. David was a murderer and an adulterer. Jonah ran from God. Naomi was a widower. Peter denied Christ 3 times. Martha, she worried about everything. Zacchaeus was small and money hungry. And Paul was a Pharisee who persecuted Christians before becoming one. But yet, on this side of the resurrection, we lump all these people into the category of saints. We claim that these people were so much amazing than we are and ever could hope to be. But the reality is, they were people just as much up as we are. And just like that, God called them for a purpose. So for the next 6 weeks, we are going to talk about how we can live into God's call on our lives. So this idea of call, it's kind of foreign to most people. As a pastor, I get to throw that word around, and most people in my circle get it. I get to tell you how God called me into ministry. I get to go to retreats where I get to define my call. And when I'm hired by a church, we go through the call process, and I get to say that I'm called to the church. But outside of the church context, the word call just doesn't make sense. We start to say things like, oh, that person's really good at that, or they are made to do X, Y, and Z. And it's in those things that you're really good at, are made to do, that God is likely calling you to do for your life. Or in the case of Moses, it's those things that you feel the least qualified to do that God has called you to. So as we begin to explore our own call, the first thing that we need to accept is that God has placed a call on each one of your lives. He may have called you to farm, or he may have called you to teach, or he may have called you to feed people, but he has called you according to his purpose. And for each of us, that call is going to look very different, but nevertheless, there is still a call on your life. And it's within that context that God is going to call you to be the priesthood of believers to share his love with the people around you. So you may think that you may not be qualified to do what God is calling you to do, but that's why we're going to take a look at Moses' life, because it might help you feel a little bit more qualified. So the first thing we need to know about Moses is that he really was just an ordinary person. And when God calls people, he calls the ordinary people. As I mentioned earlier, Moses was not a young man. He was between 75 and 80 when God called him via the burning bush. And he wasn't exactly a religious man. He did have a good education because he grew up in Pharaoh's household. But after that incident with the Egyptian man, the one where he murdered him, Moses ran away, and he was living out in the wilderness, tending sheep. So if you asked Moses, he would tell you straight out that he was not a leader, let alone a religious leader. He probably would have told you that he was happy where he was and he wasn't interested in a career change, especially a career that would be risky and take a lot of courage and faith. Moses was content tending his father-in-law's sheep, but God saw something in Moses that Moses couldn't see in himself. And the truth is the same for us. God sees things in us that we cannot see in ourselves. So God will push us out of our comfort zone. So we are forced to discover the gifts that God gave us that are buried underneath all of our insecurities. God has a pattern of doing this throughout the whole Bible. Mary, she was a teenage girl when God asked her to be the mother of his son. David was a shepherd boy when God started him on the path to becoming the great king. Peter, James, and John, they were just ordinary fishermen who had no apparent leadership skills. And these men and women, they are just as ordinary as you and I are. And just like ordinary people in the Bible, God calls you and I to serve him. And he usually does it when we least expect it. So second, when God calls us, he calls people out of their ordinary everyday lives. That day when Moses heard from God in the burning bush that didn't burn up, he was just living his life, doing what he does every other day of the week. He wasn't searching for a new purpose or a new direction, and he definitely wasn't searching for God. But then there was that bush, and there was just something so strange about it that he had to go and check it out. And that's how God got his attention. How has God captured yours? For me, this solo pastor thing was not ever on my radar. I was committed to being a youth pastor until I died. Even though I lived and breathed youth ministry, I had an affection for the whole church. But it was through those messes that kept piling up at my old church that I brought in my role into the associate pastor. And one night, out of extreme frustration, I told Blake that I just need to serve a small church in a rural town. Now, I, of course, forgot that I said that, but Blake reminded me of it later, and so did God. So my story wasn't as dramatic as this burning bush, and yours probably won't be either. But we need to realize and count on is that God is going to use the circumstances in our lives to serve him. A few months ago, the ministerium hosted the Faith Seeking Understanding with the topic of preventing suicide. Our speaker that night was a hairdresser by trade, and she had lost her son to suicide. And I'm 100% certain that she never once thought that she would be an advocate for a family who had lost a loved one to suicide, or lead the way in helping shed light on such a hushed but important topic. God called her to this role because of what she went through. She wouldn't be able to do it with the passion and understanding that she does it with if she hadn't gone through that difficult journey. Now again, I would never wish that on anyone, but I am so thankful for the work that she is doing and literally for the lives that she has saved because of it. So what is God calling you to do? And remember, age isn't a reason to ignore God. Again, Moses was in his late 70s when he challenged Pharaoh. Again, Mary was a teenager when she brought Jesus into the world. Even in our own congregation, we had Bud, who didn't discover carving until he was in his 60s. God has something for you to do, and it doesn't matter if you're 14 or 80 or somewhere in between. When he reaches down and into your ordinary life, he's going to give you an extraordinary purpose. So, think about it. How is God trying to get your attention? Another thing is when God calls, he has a specific purpose in mind. God didn't set a bush on fire and then not let it burn because he just wanted to have an ordinary conversation with Moses. He had something very specific for him to do. God told him, "I am the God who was worshipped by your ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Then God revealed to Moses the hurt that he felt for his people because of the way they were being treated. He told Moses that he heard their cry for help, and Moses was going to be the one to help lead them out of Egypt. Do you know what happens usually when God tells us his plan for our lives? We object. Moses heard what God wanted him to do, and he had every excuse he could think of to get out of it. He said, "People won't believe me. I'm a murderer. Nobody will follow me. I can't speak clearly. The king won't listen to me. He'll probably just cut off my head." Moses tried everything to get out of God's call on his life. And some of his excuses, they really did seem legitimate. But God had an answer to each of them. Who do you know that's fighting hard against following God's call in their life? Is it you? Have you become an expert at making excuses for why you can't do what God has called you to do? I had this friend. She was a stay-at-home mom, and that's what she wanted to do with her life. And that is what she was doing with her life. And she loved being home with her kids, but the days were really long for her and hard, and she had kind of lost herself. Then an opportunity came for her to apply to be the office manager at a church in town. And she really struggled with that decision to apply. She felt like if she did, she'd be placing her kids second, and then she'd become overwhelmed with the mommy guilt. Finally, she decided to do it, and she applied for the job, and she got the job. And as she spent time working in the church office, she began to thrive. That negative self-talk and the mommy guilt slowly disappeared. Then she started a MOPS group where she was able to pour herself into other moms of young children who were losing themselves as they were caring for their babies. Then she began to play piano for the worship team. And then she began to lead worship. And then she began to lead the women's ministry at the church. And this all happened because she stopped making excuses and said yes to God's call on her life to be the office manager at a church. So have you become that expert in making excuses? I think we're all quite accomplished at doing this. But we need to stop making excuses and trust that if God is calling us to do something, we need to do it. Because if we don't, we're going to miss a valuable moment to make a difference in somebody's life or make a valuable contribution to the life of the church. How many times have we made excuses hoping that somebody else would do it? You may not always see the reason that God is calling you, but be assured that when he calls you, he really has a good reason. Finally, I want you to remember that when God calls you, he equips you. He told Moses that he would help him speak, and God provided Moses' every need. The thing is, God never promised Moses that it would be easy. He just promised him that he would be there with him. So what is your story? How has God asked you to step out in faith, even though you had 5 really good excuses not to and 10 not so good reasons? Have you ever thought that maybe you'd be the worst person for a particular job, and then when you finally gave in and did it, you found out that you were really good at it? We may never know why God is calling us to do certain things, and that is okay. But what we need to remember is it's not beyond God to call you or me to do something that we've never thought of doing in our wildest dreams. So let's save ourselves and God the trouble the next time, and skip the excuses, and rest in the fact that if God is calling us to do something, that we should probably do it. Moses finally gave in, and he did it. Did he mess up along the way? Yeah. Will we? You bet we will. But it's by God's grace that we will have victories as well. And as Blake quoted earlier, if we remember Jesus' promise in Matthew 28, that he will be with us always until the end of the ages. So I want to encourage you to say yes to your call and see what God is going to do through you. And I pray that the next time that you feel God tugging on your heart to step into the unknown, that your response will not be, I don't think that your response will be, I may not think I'm the best person for the job, but God, I trust you. And I trust that you're calling me, and I'm going to trust that you go with me. And then I'm going to encourage you to take that step into the unknown. And if you think this doesn't apply to you, just wait. It does. Each of us has a call, and the question is, are you going to answer it? Will you pray with me? God, we thank you so much that you've designed each one of us to be an individual and that you've given each one of us a purpose and a call. God, I pray that as we live into the calls that you have placed in our lives, whether they be easy or whether they be very difficult, Lord, I pray that we have enough faith and trust in you to step into it. And Lord, I pray that when it gets scary or we really get to those unknown parts, Lord, that we can trust that you are going to be with us. And Lord, I pray that we have time to sit back and reflect on the things that we are doing in your kingdom, Lord, to see that when we follow you, that good things happen, Lord, and that we can see how we have grown through them. God, we thank you that no matter what we do, you go with us. So give us the courage to follow you no matter what. In your name we pray. Amen.